Today we're sitting in a 2012 Porsche 911 GTS. And we're going to take this thing for a quick drive, and I'm going to give you the particulars and what I really think about these cars. Now, they've been around for a while, and of course it's sort of old news. Porsche has come out with several generations from the 997s. Now we're into the 991s, generation 1 and 2, and now in the 992s. But these cars should not be forgotten, because Porsches, and the 911 in particular, has always been a classic car. And no model has ever become irrelevant. And so today we're going to talk about the Carrera GTS, the 911 Carrera GTS from 2012, which really essentially is one of the best generations. So let's look and do an interior tour before we go for a drive. Now we look at the old door handles here. This harkens back to the 80s. Way back when Porsche started building the 911, they still utilized this sort of an arrangement. They had your basic flat panel. This style of handle is very, very similar to what you saw in the 70s and the 80s. They had the flip-up storage compartment here, like you typically see in this newer generation in the 997s, which is, again, as I said, true to the older design. And so then we look even up into this area, and we have the window switches. This flat toggle design is very similar to what we saw in the 80s, not too far from it. So it's very connected to what Porsche was doing way back then. Then we move around the dash, and of course Porsche, in their natural evolution, things get better with age or with, newer generations, but still true to a lot of the cars that they built back in the 70s and 80s are the traditional gauge cluster, where the focal point is your RPM gauge. You have all your critical information here on the sides, and your speedometer here is slightly offset. Here, because we've got a PDK, which is the dual clutch transmission of Porsche, we've got the paddle shifters here behind the wheel, which works very well. And you'll notice they actually follow the steering wheel. Not all cars do that. The Italian cars tend to be built on the stock, whereas many of the German cars, in particular this one here, the shifters follow the steering wheel, as you can see. Other things, we've got the sports chrono package, very nice. You've got that little clock up in the center point here. Very traditional, small rimmed, small steering wheel, works very nice. And of course, nothing new for Porsche, the controls over on the left. Porsche, the old 80s style, was more of a turn and crank kind of arrangement, but even the left-handed ignition switch is classical 911. And why change what's not broken? Then we come to the center console here. So as far as 80s go, obviously this is quite revised. We're into the 997 generation. We're several decades later than the early 70s and 80s, so you would expect some updates. And they have done that with you've got the screen here in the middle with the improved interface for your music and navigation. It's all much more improved on these newer cars. Heating controls, again, a lot more revised from, typically what we saw in the old convoluted 80s style Porsche. You had those series of knobs and buttons that were scattered. They didn't seem to make a lot of sense, and to be honest, would confuse the strongest of Porsche engineers. And then we move along here. Newer for Porsche, we have cup holders. This is fairly new, relatively new in the Porsche world. A lot of the German cars did without cup holders, but now they do include those in a Porsche, which is slick and handy, and a good old-fashioned glove box. The other thing that's consistent with some of the early generations is the SAD back seats, which you'll notice back here, which really is only an afterthought. It's not intended. This really is more of a two-seater sports car. Porsche did that just as a matter of convenience. If you have to get somebody else home for whatever reason, you've got an extra person, you need to get them home after a long night of partying, it's a great place to put somebody, or a small child, for example. So then let's do a quick exploratory on the front and the back end of the car. So down here we have the switches to release either the front trunk space or your rear engine lid. So let's pop those and take a quick look. And now pop in the front hood. Let's take a look under there. And we lift that up, and you can see there's a vast amount of space in here. You could fit a couple of bags for a great weekend away to the mountains or some little excursion with your girlfriend or your wife. And there you have the latest 3.8 liter flat six engine that motivates this wonderful 911 Carrera GTS to great speeds. Tucked away nicely, actually relatively accessible versus some of the latest 991 series cars, which are much more difficult to work on. And on this GTS, you have those matte black wheels, very sharp looking. Take a closer look at that. Very beautiful design. So before we get rolling here, let's talk about Porsche's specifications on this car. Firstly is the transmission. And this transmission is Porsche's 7-speed PDK. That's their dual clutch transmission, and we'll talk to it as we drive. I'll explain how that more or less works, but it is their version, and honestly, Porsche has one of the best dual clutch transmissions in the business. That's their PDK. Okay, so let's set off now. Let's get this thing a-roaring. Okay, so first of all, you can do a couple of different things in the transmission. So you press down and you pull it all the way back to move it into drive. Then if you want to go manual mode, you slide it over and you can shift accordingly like that. And so we're going to leave it in manual mode, and we're going to use the paddle shifters right here behind the steering wheel. So let's get setting off. All right, so off and running. The first thing you notice is how smooth this PDK transmission actually engages on takeoff. Now, I've driven a lot of cars with single automated manual trannies, and honestly, they're horrible. A lot of them are shaky and lurchy, and they do a real horrible job of take-up. Sure, a lot of them are good once you're on the fly, but they don't do the same job like a dual clutch transmission, such as the PDK does here. So we're cruising along, and now we're in rainy weather, and we'll tell you how this car does in some rain. But generally, as a rule, this really brings back the flavor of a Porsche. Even though this car is fairly new, it reminds me of the 80s Porsches that I used to drive. It still has that bob and weave sensation to it, where you can tell the front end is slightly lighter than the back, or it has that sensation. And it has that wonderful exhaust note that you get from that 3.8 liter flat six engine that produces 408 horsepower and about 310 pound-feet of torque, peak torque. Okay, so the stats on paper, 0 to 60 miles an hour, 4 seconds. Quarter mile, 12.5. Top speed, well, hey, it's a Porsche, what do you expect? So here, let's do a freeway on-ramp run and see how it goes. Yeah. I would definitely believe those statistics, possibly even quicker. We always know that Porsche does a great job of sandbagging their numbers. It's pretty easily to believe that this car could probably do better than 4 seconds flat. During that acceleration, as we accelerated hard under wet conditions, as you can see, it's raining quite heavily here, accelerating in the corners in the wet, the car did a great job of composing itself. There was no fear of the car going sideways or darting and weaving, and I never once felt during that acceleration run that the car was going to go sideways or do the 360. That was a classic phenomenon of some of the 80s Porsches back in the day. Why? Because over generations, Porsche has done a great job of working and engineering the weight transfer of the engine forward. This car has more of the weight of the engine moved forward, so it no longer has all that weight slung out so far at the back end, forcing the car to push itself out and creating that sort of pendulum effect. This car is very, very well dialed in, and honestly, does a great job of managing its weight and its balance. So the one thing I noticed, even though it's the 3.8 liter and it has the improved tractability over the standard engine, which you'd find in a standard Carrera, which is the 3.6 liter, this being the 3.8, I do find it's still a little bit of a dog down below. So as you accelerate from a low RPM, I find that it is still a little bit sluggish. It has a tendency to sort of bog a little bit at low revs. You still need to find yourself accelerating and getting those RPMs up a little bit before you really get into it. Otherwise, the car bogs a bit. So here we go. There's from 2,800 RPM. So that seems to be kind of the sweet spot. And if you're accelerating from, say, about 3,000 RPM on, it does a great job of taking off and delivering you the power and the torque that you hope from this engine. if you try to accelerate hard from say 1500 RPM or even lower, of course, some people do in traffic, it doesn't jerk and buck. It just doesn't have that, you can tell it's out of its sweet spot. It doesn't have the power. So you still need to accelerate. You still need to rev the engine to get the power out of it. Okay, so beautiful. What can you say? Now, one thing I've noticed, because we're in the GTS Cabriolet, one would expect typically a fair amount of cowl shake or, you know, some twisting and a lack of rigidity in the chassis. That's really not at all what I found here. The car stays as tight as you can expect it to. Now, if you were to push the car to the extreme limits on a racetrack, I would expect you'd start revealing some of those limitations. But the way it works right now on any kind of street driving, probably even a moderate amount of performance driving, you don't feel an ounce of twisting, cowl shake, odd noises coming from the hood or any of that, or the roof line. Everything feels very taut, as it should be in a 911. So it's not a disappointing experience having the convertible at all. The only disadvantage is with the convertible, as we have here in the Cabriolet, is there's a slight bit of weight penalty. Obviously, there's a little bit of extra weight due to the increased chassis work to get it, you know, make it more stiff, make it more durable for those driving experiences. You do take on a little extra weight. Outside of that, it does a great job of shedding its weight nicely. As well as I noticed the brakes, again, typical Porsche. What can you say? They're the business. They are the business. And honestly, brakes and handling and chassis, Porsche owns that. So the brakes don't let you down here either. They do a great job of taking you down, scrubbing the speed off, and get you down to a safe place. Okay, so let's summarize this whole driving experience with the GTS, the 997 GTS. And in short, it is nothing but amazing. This car is spectacular for what it is. It accelerates very quickly. It has an awesome transmission. That PDK works very, very well. And I love the manuals, but it works very well. And I don't feel that you have compromised by buying this car with the PDK. The transmission does a great job. The powertrain is solid, very tractable. The roof works very well, ups and downs. The car is very attractive, and the sounds are there. This is one of the best 911s that you can get today. The 997 GTS is likely going to be a classic somewhere down the road. It has the wonderful headlights. It has a better flared body. So if you're looking at the 996s, that's what the fans of the 996s were lacking. This car delivers, gives you fatter flares, gives you the nicer headlights, and it gives you the powertrain and the sound that you once experienced or that you once wish you had from the 80s cars. Beautiful car, lovely experience, and honestly, definitely worth the bang for your buck. So guys, I really hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure if you did, you give it a thumbs up, like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I really hope to see you guys soon. Catch you then. Bye-bye.